Welcome to our Fiscal Basics 2-day training. Today is day 2, and we want to thank you for joining us. Today, we're happy that you came back. We hope we didn't scare you away with all the knowledge and information we passed along 2 weeks ago. We hope everyone was able to enjoy some time off last week with family and friends. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the LCAP-State and Federal Programs Unit. Today joining us is Debbie Cano, Helen Choi, Augustine Garcia, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and Anita Lomeli. And I also want to introduce our Secretary, Maribel Leyva. To access today's presentation, we ask you to please click on the link in the chat. It will take you to our Canvas page. The presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, and the agenda and resources are listed and available here as well. We are recording today's workshop, and we will be posting the link. And once we complete the Q&A, you will also find it here. In addition to our presentation, we have additional resources to support your work with the fiscal oversight of your federal programs. Again, we are finishing up the updating of the Fiscal Fundamental Guide and the Time and Effort Reporting materials. So if you'd like to get the updated materials, you can find the ordering information at the link at the bottom of the slide. As usual, please place your questions in the chat and we will answer any questions that we can. And we will also follow up with written responses in a Q&A. And this will be emailed to everyone who is registered to this 2-day fiscal workshop. And we will post it on our Canvas page as shown before. So let's get started. Today, we will focus on time and effort reporting, the Title I fiscal cornerstones of maintenance of effort, comparability of services, and supplement, not supplant. Next, we will cover equipment and contracts, and then we will end with federal program monitoring, looking at the fiscal compliance through fiscal monitoring and the federal stimulus monitoring instrument. We want to remind you again of some of the documents that we referenced in day 1 and again in today's workshop. Remember, ESSA is the statute, which is the current authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that forms the legal basis for most federal programs. The Uniform Grants Guidance is another name for the Code of Federal Regulations, which includes the requirements for all federal education programs. The CSAM is the California School Accounting Manual, which is the state's guidance for fiscal accounting and determinations. And EDGAR is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations or grants guidance, and it provides additional requirement and clarification for programs operated by the Education Department. One additional reference that we want to share is CDE's Federal Grants Fiscal Guidance. The CDE Federal Grants Fiscal Guidance contains information on developing policies and procedures and federal and state program and administrative requirements. Other topics include allowability, time and effort, cash management, supplement not supplant, procurement, and inventory and property management. In addition, you will also find answers to frequently asked fiscal and programmatic questions in this document. You can download this from the CDE Federal Fiscal Grant Guidance webpage, and the link is at the bottom. And now I will turn it over to Helen and Anita, who will begin explaining time and effort reporting.
Good afternoon, everyone. In this section, we will cover time and effort reporting. The lack of time and effort reporting is one of the largest audit findings in the U.S. Office of Inspector General, or OIG. And remember that costs that do not have adequate documentations are deemed unallowable and subject to repayment. So in this section, we will provide you with information to enhance your understanding of time and effort reporting and time accounting. So what triggers time and effort reporting and time accounting? Federal regulations require time and effort documentation in addition to, let's say, like a time cards that you might have for all your personnel who received any payment or compensation from federal funds. In addition, some restricted state funds such as expanded learning will require time and effort documentation. So the documentation will depend and will vary depending on the funding source in terms of whether it's Title I, Title II, Title III, or IV, as well as the nature of the job duties. Payroll time reporting must also reflect the actual hours that were worked on each program as indicated and should be aligned to the time and effort certification documents. So again, there must be alignment between compensation and the documentation that memorializes what has been done. This must be done no matter how much federal funding is included in their salary, whether it's just a penny or the entire 100%, all 100%. And that is what triggers the time and effort reporting. So let's start with the three basics: the why, the who, and the what. Why time and effort? Time and effort is to ensure that there are adequate and consistent internal controls and that restricted federal fund programs are accurately charged. The who, as mentioned, is for any employees funded by federal grants, and they must maintain documentation showing that their time is allocable to a federal program. And finally, what is it? This is documentation on records that accurately reflect the work performed. This is the evidence about the past in form kept in writing or some other permanent form. This is the official record that encompasses all activities that complied with established accounting policies and practices. We often have employees working from multiple funding sources. If this is the case, the LEA must confirm that the allocation of funding is supporting the federal program. For example, if an employee is supporting student achievement in a school-wide Title I program and also working with a small group of English learners to support their learning with Title III funds, please check in with the employee regularly to see if they're charging or accounting for the time that they spend in each program. Employees might believe that they are serving the school just by going to where they are needed the most, but this could cause a problem with allocability if the percentage is not consistently reviewed. Also, please document all time and effort spent. If the employee works 10 hours a day, we need to see all 10 hours documented, whether or not it's being charged to one federal fund, multiple funds, or mix of state, local, or federal funds. During our day one of our workshop in the internal control section, it makes a note of cost objective. So what is cost objective? Let's first learn about the definition of cost objective. As defined by 2 CFR 200.1, cost objective is defined as a program, function, activity, award, organizational subdivision, contract, or work unit for which cost data are desired. And cost data is factual information concerning the cost of labor, material, overhead, and other cost elements which are expected to be incurred by a contractor in performing the contract. This concept is important when we talk about time and effort reporting because it will help determine how these should be documented. It is often hard to understand it at first, and in the next slides, we're going to go deeper into this topic. The basics of cost objective is that a single cost objective is a set of work activities where both services being performed and population being served are allowable under any program supporting the cost objective. Usually, this is a single program and a funding source. However, multiple funding sources may address single common objective. For example, both activity and the targeted population being served is allowable under all funding sources. For example, Title I and Title II professional development for reading intervention strategies for low-income students. In this case, both populations being served and the activity being provided could be funded 100% from either program. So this could be a single cost objective. And this example could be paid from one funding source or multiple funding sources. So the test is, could you pay the employee 100% from each fund? So multiple cost objectives usually involves more than one funding source or different activities for different purposes. A single funding source or program may include multiple objectives. For example, services that are Title I direct services and Title I administration would have to be reported as separate cost objectives. So keeping this in mind, this question for a single funding source. Do these activities, expenditures need to be tracked and accounted for separately? So when in doubt, consider activities as multiple cost objectives. So now I'll turn it over to Anita to continue with this section. Take it away.
Thank you, Helen. And so you may be asking, okay, where do all these rules and regulations for time and effort reporting come from? And that's a great question to ask, one I asked myself. Regulatory law is codified by the federal government of the United States in these books, the Code of Federal Regulations. The CFR is divided into 50 titles, each dealing with a broad subject area. Title II of the CFR deals with grants and agreements, and more specifically, Title II of the CFR, Part 200, Section 430, Paragraph I, Subparagraph 1, denotes the standards for documentation of personnel expenses and specifies that charges to federal awards such as Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. And in order for your records to be up to code, if you will, the records must meet certain requirements. What are the requirements for these time and effort reporting documents that satisfy a reflection of accurate work performed? Well, records must, in accordance to the CFRs, be supported by a system of internal controls which provides reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. Be incorporated into the LEA's official records. Reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated, not exceeding 100% of compensated activities. Encompass both federally assisted and all other activities for which the employee is compensated. Comply with established accounting principles and practices of the LEA and those procedures found in the CSAM, and support distribution of salary among specific activities or cost objectives if the employee works on one or more federal awards, a federal and a non-federal award, or an indirect and indirect cost activity. Each LEA must ensure that its timekeeping efforts comply with the requirements of the uniform guidance. And so even though PARs and semi-annual certifications, which you may have heard or use, are not specifically required by code, these documents are still very relevant because they do address these requirements. And it's a good best practice to continue with these in your LEA to stay up to code. So let's take a look at how LEAs typically decide on how to report time and effort. So we took a look at a single and multiple cost objectives earlier because the type of cost objective or objectives an employee works is the main factor in determining which federal time and effort documentation will need to be completed. Employees who work solely on a single federal award or a single cost objective need only complete a periodic semi-annual certification. The periodic certification must be signed at least semi-annually or twice a year, be signed by the employee or the supervisory official having first-hand knowledge of the work performed, and state that the employee works solely on that single federal program or single cost objective during the period covered by the certification. Employees who work on multiple activities or multiple cost objectives, of which at least one funding source requires a time and effort report for time accounting, must complete a personnel activity report or equivalent documentation. PARs, or equivalent documentation, must reflect an after the fact distribution of the actual activity of each employee, account for the total activity for which each employee is compensated, be prepared at least monthly and coincide with one or more pay periods, and be signed by the employee. Remember, as mentioned earlier, that neither federal regulations nor the CDE require LEAs to use a specific format for documenting salaries and wages. As long as the format satisfies the requirements listed on this slide, semi-annual certifications and PARs are a good choice to use. We will provide samples in the upcoming slides for this to make more sense. Additional samples of forms can also be found in CSAM under Procedure 905. So now that employees have provided services that are allowable, allocable, and necessary, and the necessary time accounting records have been completed, collected, checked for accuracy, and are up to code, signed, sealed, delivered, they're yours, all is well. Well, now the time has come to reconcile reports and cost allocations. Does your LEA reconcile budgeted distributions with the actual cost based on the time accounting records submitted by verifying that the amounts and categories of the expenses match the entries in the ledger? This process is important to follow to ensure accuracy. And budget estimates alone, which we all do at the beginning of a school year, or other distribution percentages determined before services are performed, do not qualify as support for charges to federal funds. But these figures may be used for interim accounting purposes, provided that certain procedures are in place. In other words, after the employee has completed time and effort documentation, you must true it up throughout the year. Your budgeted estimates at the beginning of the year versus the actual services performed by the end of the year may be different. The process of estimating the budget and checking in on what actually is expended is a continuous process. And so what does this reconciliation process look like? First, the LEA system for establishing the estimates produces reasonable approximation of the activities actually performed. The closer you get, the better and less paperwork. Make sure you make time to compare budgeted distributions with actual costs based on the monthly activity reports, at least quarterly. If the variances between total budgeted and total actual costs are 10% or more, adjustments must be made at least quarterly to the LEA's financial records. If the variances are less than 10%, the adjustments may be recorded annually. All necessary adjustments must be made such that the final amount charged to the federal award is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. Your internal control system must include a process for the after-the-fact review of reports. And so, in summary, the bottom line for time and effort reporting can be summarized with the following major points. Any employee paid with any amount of federal funds or required from a state program must keep accurate records to support time and effort benefiting the federal or restricted state program. The LEA must have written procedures in place describing how this will take place in the LEA. Who completes the form? When are they trained? Where are the forms found? When are they completed? When are they submitted? To whom? Who checks them? Etc. All employees paid from one or more source and cost objective require more detailed reporting. And the differences between actual time and effort reported and the budgeted amounts must be reconciled so that the work or reports match up as closely as possible. And remember that because this involves salaries and benefits, compliance findings for time and effort can result in significant payback of funds. And so now that we've covered cost objectives and time and effort documentation, let's explore the specific documents that are required as evidence for FPM. To start, let's look at a duty statement. This is a sample duty statement for an academic intervention teacher paid entirely from Title I funds. This document outlines the unique daily task and responsibility specific to this person's role. Listed is the name, the position, the work site, the funding percentage, and job duties. Following this duty statement that we just saw of Gabe Cotter, the academic intervention teacher from the previous slide, this single cost objective intervention teacher would use a semi-annual certification document. And as you can see on this sample showed on this slide, which is also included in the CSAM under Procedure 905, We have dates, a name, job title, funding information, a certification statement, and a place for a signature from the employee and or the supervisory official. Remember that semi-annual certifications must be after the fact, account for the total activity, be signed by the employer or supervisor with first-hand knowledge of services performed, and done twice a year or semi-annually. Another certification worth mentioning is a blanket semi-annual certification. And this comes from something called the Montana Compact, and we've included the link here at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide in case you want to read the document in detail. If a supervisor has firsthand knowledge of work performed by several employees on the same activity, a single certification may be used for all of those employees. And this certainly can help to streamline the process when applicable. A single certification or blanket certification must include the names of all the employees that work under the same single cost objective, the cost objective worked in accordance with the duty statement, and the time period covered. Again, this single record would be signed by the supervisory official having firsthand knowledge of the work performed by the employees listed on this blanket semi-annual certification. And for an employee that has multiple cost objectives, CDE has shared this sample of a personnel activity report. The person's daily activities are detailed by time and funding sources for each day in the month. And for personnel activity reporting, it must be after the fact, account for the total activity of the employee's day, signed by the employee, and prepared at least monthly and coincide with one or more pay periods. This can be quite a tedious and time-consuming task for employees. I know, because I used to have to do it. And this is why it's important to create a system that will assist the staff member to complete the par or equivalent documentation with ease. Perhaps ensuring the employee has the document prior to the start of the month or the pay period. Perhaps being able to download the document online would be beneficial so that the employee can account for their day at the end of each day, for example, so that it doesn't become overwhelming. Another document that is required is a PCD, a position control document. Here in this sample, here's a sample, and this must include the employee's full name, the position title in its entirety, the funding source or sources, the percentage of each funding source as applicable, the hours worked, and if it's using Title I funds, you must indicate the 85-15% rule regarding indirect or direct costs and allowable reservations. Now, during the later part of this presentation, we will be providing you with resources where you can find additional samples of time and effort reports. And now I'm going to welcome back Helen Choi for an engagement activity with you all. And I want to thank all of you for your time and effort today, and the pun is intended.
Thank you, Anita. So to end this section, we have a little quiz for you. So place your answer in the chat. The question is, if a position has a single cost objective, which documentation is most appropriate? A, semi-annual certification, B, personnel activity report, or known as PAR, or don't worry about it, documentation is not needed. Place your answer in the chat. Thank you so much. I see all the answers coming in. I think we have amazing participation and amazing track record. And I like that answer, by the way, wishing for a C, but sorry, no. We do need the most appropriate one would be the semi-annual certification. So thank you, and many of you guys have it. And again, please keep in mind that time and effort documentation is required for any employees funded by federal grants, and it must show that their time is allocable to the program. The documentation must be based on records that accurately reflect on the work performed, which is the cost objective. And thank you again. And now I will turn it over to Rachel for Title I Fiscal Cornerstones. Take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at the 3 Title I Fiscal Cornerstones. And this includes maintenance of effort, comparability, and supplement not supplant. And so these three fiscal requirements have historically formed the basis for federal education programs and are referred to as the cornerstones of Title I. Both maintenance of effort and supplement not supplant apply to other federal programs. However, only Title I includes a comparability requirement. And so taken together, they mean that districts must maintain state and local effort, provide services with state and local funds that are at least comparable to those provided to schools not receiving those funds, and also use federal funds to supplement, not supplant, non-federal funds otherwise available from state and local sources. And we'll be taking a look at each of these fiscal requirements in this section. And so first off, we have maintenance of effort. So maintenance of effort is a district level determination that's made annually by the CDE at the end of the fiscal year. And the purpose is to ensure that states and districts maintain the level of fiscal effort in supporting education programs from year to year, and not lower the local or state level of support as a result of receiving federal funds. Maintenance of effort applies to multiple federal programs, but it's applied somewhat differently depending on the program. So for ESSA programs, the state agency must demonstrate that either the combined fiscal effort per student or the aggregate expenditures of the LEA from state and local funds in the preceding year was not less than 90% of that for the second preceding fiscal year. And so if an LEA fails to meet that minimum level in a given fiscal year, and also for one or more of the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years, then all ESSA program funds must be reduced in the same proportion to which the LEA failed to meet that 90% requirement. So here we've included an example of the maintenance of effort calculation. And so again, there are 2 ways to calculate maintenance of effort. So either the combined fiscal effort per student or the aggregate expenditures of the LEA. And so this chart shows both ways, and it uses fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023 as the comparison years. So in this example, the LEA needed to spend $5,490 per student during fiscal year 2023 to meet the 90% level, but it only spent $5,200 per student. That means the LEA failed to maintain effort by $290 or 5.3% on a per student basis. At the aggregate level, the LEA needed to spend $900,000 during the fiscal year 2023 to meet the 90% level, but it only spent $850,000. As a result, the LEA failed to maintain effort by $50,000 or 5.6%. And so one thing to keep in mind is that the state will use the percentage that is the most advantageous to the LEA. So in this example, that would be the 5.3%. So if the LEA also failed to meet the maintenance of effort requirement for one or more of the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years, then that means the state must reduce the LEA's 2023-24 allocation by 5.3% for all ESSA programs. One other important thing to note is that the Secretary of Education has the authority to waive the maintenance of effort requirements due to exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances, or also a precipitous decline in the LEA's financial resources. So again, LEAs are not required to calculate maintenance of effort. This is something that is calculated annually by the CDE at the end of the year. However, LEAs should be monitoring significant reductions in expenditures of state and local funds and alert leadership that this could lead to possible reductions in federal funding amounts in the subsequent years. Okay, so next we'll be taking a look at Title I comparability. So LEAs receiving Title I Part A funds must demonstrate that all schools are providing comparable services using state and local funds. And this is a prerequisite for receiving Title I Part A funds. The purpose of the comparability requirement is to ensure that LEAs provide at least the same amount of funding to schools receiving Title I funds as they do to non-Title I schools. So comparability is determined on a school-by-school basis, and the calculation is made at the district level. Also, the calculations must be completed annually and in a timely manner to ensure that all schools are in a comparable position, also to allow the district to make any necessary adjustments with the least amount of disruption, and to avoid the loss of Title I Part A funding. So to meet comparability requirements, LEAs must file a written assurance with the state, develop procedures for compliance with comparability requirements, and maintain records demonstrating that comparability of services calculations are conducted on an annual basis. When completing these calculations, LEAs must confirm that the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios fall within a reasonable variance. And in California, this has been determined to be a 30% variance. So the written assurance that LEAs must file with the state assures that the LEA has established and implemented an LEA-wide salary schedule. Also, a policy to ensure equivalence among schools in teachers, administrators, and other staff, and a policy to ensure equivalence among schools in the provision of curriculum materials and instructional supplies. And so LEAs assure compliance with these assurances through completion and submission of the certification of assurances form that's submitted in the spring CONAP. And so here on this slide, you can see a screenshot of all of the legal assurances that are included in the CONAP, as well as a screenshot of the comparability assurances. So LEAs must use student enrollment to full-time equivalent teacher ratios to determine whether schools are comparable in one of two ways. So either by comparing all schools within the LEA as a whole, or by comparing all schools within the LEA by each grade span group. And so as noted previously, the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios must fall within a 30% variance. If schools are not comparable, then the LEA must make adjustments to ensure that all schools are comparable. And completing these calculations early will allow the LEA to make any needed adjustments with the least amount of disruption. It's recommended that LEAs complete these calculations and make any adjustments in staffing or funding by October 31st of each year. So there are several exclusions when determining comparability. So first off, LEAs are not required to include any unpredictable changes that occur after the beginning of the school year, such as changes in student enrollment or personnel assignments. Schools with 200 or fewer students may also be excluded from the comparability calculations. And if the LEA is a single school LEA or only has one school for each grade span group, then the comparability requirement does not apply. LEAs may also exclude state or local funds expended for language instruction programs and the excess cost of providing services to students with disabilities. And lastly, LEAs may exclude state and local funds expended under SS Section 1113B1D and 1113C2B for programs that meet the intent and purposes of Title I, Part A. Now, in addition to the exclusions that were indicated on the previous slide, there are several school types that are exempt from meeting Title I comparability requirements. And so these exemptions include alternative schools of choice, continuation high schools, county community schools, district community day schools, juvenile court schools, opportunity schools, public special education schools, and also youth authority schools. So the CDE has developed calculation forms to assist LEAs with this process, and also to provide LEAs with immediate information on whether or not a school meets comparability. And so the instructions and calculation forms, as well as other resources related to comparability, can be accessed on the CDE website at the link provided on the slide. The calculation forms are in Excel format, and they provide LEAs with the option to determine comparability either LEA-wide or by grade span group. And so the screenshot that's included on this slide is the form for calculating comparability by the LEA-wide average. When completing the forms, LEAs need to enter the school name, school type, grade span group code, student enrollment, and total full-time equivalent teachers for all schools included in the school students counts report in CARS. The last two columns will automatically populate based on the student enrollment and the FTE teacher information that's entered. And then the last column will indicate whether or not the school is comparable. If you calculate comparability based on one method, such as the LEA-wide average, and find that the school is not comparable, it's recommended that you try the other option, so that would be the grade span group average, to determine comparability. And then if after trying both options, a school is still not comparable, then that's when the LEA would need to make adjustments to meet the comparability requirements. One important thing to remember is that the student enrollment data and full-time equivalent teacher data must be captured on the same date for every school within the LEA. So it's important that you maintain documentation that this data is captured on the same date. And also, the calculations should only include teachers whose salaries are paid using state and local funds. So if you have teachers who are split funded, be sure to calculate the FTE using only the percentage of the salary that's paid with the state or local funds. So here we see an example of a completed comparability form based on the LEA-wide average. So in this example, you can see that middle school A is not comparable. So in this case, you would then try the other option, which is by grade span group average. As I mentioned, these calculation forms are in Excel format. And so the nice thing is that once you complete the information in the LEA-wide average tab, it will automatically populate the data for you into the grade span group tabs, so you won't have to enter the information again. Another thing to note is that in this form, you can see that two schools are exempt, as indicated in that last column. So elementary school C is exempt because it has less than 200 students, and high school B is exempt because it's a continuation school. So the form will automatically populate the last column with exempt if the school has 200 or less students, or if it meets one of those school type exemptions. So here we see an example based on the grade span group average with the same elementary and middle school data from the previous slide. So the first screenshot shows the elementary grade span group, and the second shows the middle school grade span group. So you can see that by using the grade span group average calculation, Middle School A is now comparable. So in this example, it worked out for Middle School A using the grade span group option. However, if after trying both options, a school is still not comparable, then that's when the LEA would need to make adjustments in staffing or funding to meet the comparability requirements. So as mentioned, LEAs must develop procedures for compliance with comparability requirements. And so keep in mind that procedures should be in writing and should include the LEA's timeline for demonstrating comparability. Also, the measure and process used to determine comparability, and also how and when adjustments are made in schools that are not comparable. LEAs must also maintain documentation to support the comparability calculations, as well as any documentation demonstrating that adjustments were made to staffing to ensure comparability. And so LEAs are required to maintain documentation for 3 years after the completion of the activity for which funds were used. However, we recommend maintaining this documentation for 5 years. And so just some final reminders, comparability requirements are monitored through the FPM process. And so specifically in the Compensatory Education Instrument, item 14. And so examples of evidence request for this item would include completed LEA comparability calculation forms, the current district-wide salary schedule, the LEA's policy to ensure equivalence among schools in teachers, administrators, and other staff, and also the LEA's policy to ensure equivalence in the provision of curriculum materials and instructional supplies. And then evidence of local governing board approval of the comparability policy. So if your LEA receives Title I Part A funds, it will be important to verify that your LEA has these required policies and procedures in place and is also annually completing these comparability calculations. And so now I will turn it over to Debbie for Supplement Not Supplant.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. So this section is Supplement Not Supplant. Next slide. Thank you. So as we start this section on Supplement Not Supplant, I wanted to begin with the simple definitions of these words. Supplement is both a noun and a verb. It is something that completes or enhances something else when added to it, or it adds an extra element or amount to something. And supplant is a verb meaning to supersede and replace. The analogy I've heard, and I'm sure many of you also have heard throughout my career, has been the ice cream. As you see here, vanilla ice cream with extra toppings and the sprinkle and the cherry on top. That would be considered supplementing. Now, when we go to supplanting, it would be like replacing this simple vanilla ice cream with chocolate. And sure, chocolate might be better for some folks, but essentially it is simply a single flavor being replaced by another single flavor, supplanting. Next slide, please. So all ESSA federal programs have a supplement, not supplant requirement. In general, the supplement, not supplant requirement means that an LEA may use federal funds only to supplement and increase the level of funds that are available for the education of students, and in no case may federal funds be used to supplant or take the place of funds from non-federal sources. Under ESSA, the test for compliance with the supplement not supplant provision changed for Title I Part A, but remained the same for all other ESSA programs. Next slide. As mentioned on the previous slide, the supplement not supplant compliance test for Title I Part A changed under ESSA and is much different than in the past. Previously, LEAs had to ensure costs passed the test of presumptions of what the LEA would have provided in the absence of Title I funds. These presumptions no longer apply to Title I. LEAs must demonstrate that the methodology used to allocate state and local funds to each school receiving Title I funds ensures that each school receives all of the state and local funds it would otherwise receive if the school were not receiving Title I funds. An LEA receiving Title I funds must ensure the determination is met for both at the school level and the LEA level expenditures in order to demonstrate compliance with the SNS methodology requirement. Next slide. So to determine school level expenditures that ensure school level expenditures meet supplement not supplant requirements, the LEA must be able to demonstrate that each Title I school is allocated all of the state and local funds it would be entitled to if it were not receiving Title I funds. In other words, the LEA methodology must be Title I neutral, meaning it does not take the Title I status into consideration, and thus it does not reduce state and local funds to a Title I school when allocating funds. It is up to the LEA to determine what methodology to use when allocating state and local funds to schools, as long as it is Title I neutral. LEAs must also meet the SNS methodology determination with regards to LEA level expenditures. When an LEA is planning to expend or obligate state and local funds and Title I funds on an LEA-wide initiative, the LEA must look at the funding it intends to use and then determine whether the Title I schools will receive their equal share of the non-federal funds. For example, if an LEA is implementing an intervention program across the district and is using state funds to fund the program in non-Title I schools and Title I funds to fund the program in Title I schools, this would be supplement not supplant violation because the LEA is not providing state funds to the Title I school on the same basis as the non-Title I schools. Essentially, the LEA must make sure that the non-federal funds are neutrally distributed, and then the Title I funds are used for supplementary purposes for the Title I schools. Next slide, please. As mentioned, it is up to the LEA to determine the methodology to use when allocating state and local funds to schools, and there are many options available to LEAs when making this determination. So here we see one example of a methodology based on student characteristics. This example allocates state and local funds to schools based on a standard formula through which an LEA allocates dollar amounts based on an objective student characteristic. In this example, there are varying per pupil allocations based on the characteristics of students in each school, including a base allocation per student and additional funding per low-income student, English learner, students with disabilities, and preschool students. To meet the supplement not supplant requirement for Title I, an LEA would use this methodology to allocate state and local funds to each school without the regard to this Title I status. Next slide, please. And here on this slide, we see another example of a methodology. And this one is based on personnel and non-personnel costs. This example allocates state and local funds to schools based on the average LEA-wide salary for each category of school personnel, such as principals, librarians, school counselors, and teachers, and the average LEA-wide per pupil expenditure for non-personnel resources, such as instructional materials and supplies. So in a school of 400 students, the LEA would allocate $1,945,000 in state and local funds to the school based on the calculations in the table. These are some examples of methodologies that would meet the supplement not supplant requirement, since each example is not contingent on Title I status of the school. Next slide, please. So we've talked about Title I. Now we're going to switch to Title II, III, and IV, all which contain supplement not supplant provisions under ESSA. However, there are differences in how those requirements apply. In general, federal funds may not be used to supplant non-federal funds that would otherwise be used for activities authorized under the program. It's important to note that Title III has a higher threshold to meet supplement, not supplant requirements because it requires that the program funds supplement not only state and local funds, but also other federal funds. So essentially, the supplanting analysis simply asks, what would have happened in the absence of federal funds? If in the absence of receiving any funding under a given federal program, the LEA would still have paid for the textbooks, computer, or salary in question using non-federal funds, then it would be a supplanting violation to use the federal funding to pay for this expenditure. Federal funds are intended to provide something extra. Remember, the sprinkles and the cherry. Next slide, please. Oh, we're there. Okay, for most federal programs such as Title II, III, and IV, auditors presume that supplanting has occurred based on 3 tests. For the first test, auditors presume that supplanting has occurred if the LEA uses federal funds to provide services that the LEA was required to make available under other federal, state, or local laws. Second, the test presumes supplanting has occurred if the LEA uses federal funds to provide services that the LEA provided with non-federal funds in the prior year. And remember, for Title III, this also includes other federal funds in addition to non-federal funds. And third, this test presumes supplanting has occurred if the LEA uses federal funds to provide services for participating children that the LEA provided with non-federal funds for non-participating children. For this presumption, the presumption test, the OMB compliant supplement reference only the migrant education program. However, the USDE uses this test as a basis to presume supplanting as well. It may be possible to challenge these presumptions provided the LEA can provide documentation to demonstrate that it would not have been able to provide those services if federal funds had not been available. Such documentation would include local board action, budget history, and planning documents. This type of documentation might be sufficient to challenge the second or third presumption, but it would be very difficult to challenge the first presumption because you likely cannot show that you wouldn't have done what was legally required. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, supplement, not supplant requirements are monitored through the FPM process. And here we see screenshots from some of the program instruments in which it's monitored. The program instruments provide examples of evidence requests and documentation that should be maintained for the specific items. So this is, again, as we always tell you, the FPM instrument is a very good place to go as you plan to ensure your documentation and your records are maintained in a compliant way. And now we're going to turn it over to Jeannie for equipment and contracts.
Thank you, Debbie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you. So our next section addresses funding and purchases for equipment and contracts. We'll take a look at requirements for keeping track of equipment and materials, as well as contracts. With your equipment control system, all equipment that is purchased with federal funds needs to be inventoried and labeled with purchasing information. This would include the funding source, identification code, serial number, the name of the district and school. LEAs must also ensure there are procedures in place to guard against any loss of equipment and materials. This screenshot on the slide offers a sample label indicating the LEA's name, school name, program it was purchased from, the purchase date, delivery date, serial number, and salvage date. For equipment control, the Uniform Grant Guidance states that All non-consumable equipment and supplies must be accounted for if they exceed the $500 in value cost and have a useful life of 1 or more year. An additional aspect to your inventory system is regarding items that are less than $500. The Uniform Grant Guidance identifies these as computing devices, and you can see some equipment items less than $500 unit cost included on the slide. These smaller items could easily go missing. So it's important to determine what is your policy and procedure to monitor computing devices and to keep track of these devices. How does your LEA account for small and attractive new technology that may cost less than $500, but could easily walk away? Additionally, what is your system to prevent theft and loss? A suggestion may be to include these on an inventory list as well. A separate inventory to account for these items may be part of your system to prevent theft and loss. Next slide, please. Thank you. So evidence is requested during the federal program monitoring for the LEA's equipment inventory. It is required as part of the Title I, Title III, and Federal Stimulus Monitoring Program instruments, as well as Adult Education, Expanded Learning Programs, CTE, Homeless Education, Migrant Ed, School Support and Improvement, and program instruments for neglected or delinquent program monitoring, as well as Early Education Division monitoring. So there's a lot of programs for which the equipment inventory is an item on the federal program monitoring instrument. In the compensatory education instrument, as shown here, 16.0 states that the LEA spending Title I Part A funding on equipment shall maintain a historical inventory for each piece of equipment with an acquisition cost of $500 or more per unit. A note to point out here is the word historical means that the inventory record must contain the history of the equipment inventory. So this is an ongoing inventory showing the useful life of the equipment. As you review your current inventory, some questions to consider are, what will you need to add to your current inventory list to address equipment items for multiple federal programs? How will you inform all personnel and departments purchasing equipment within your federal programs of these requirements for keeping the historical inventory of each equipment item that costs $500 or more from when it was acquired? The CE16 item lists multiple components listed on the slide as letters A through M that your equipment inventory must include. You can see the required items provide extensive identification information specific to each item for specific programs, as well as who holds the title and the acquisition date and original cost, location, as well as disposition data for items no longer being used for the specific program. Let's go on to the next slide, please. You may be aware that the equipment inventory also must include equipment that is supporting the federal programs at private schools. Equipment located at private schools needs to include the same labeling information as equipment that is located at district locations. This label includes the district name that is the same that is included on the district label for each equipment item. It is important to inform and remind private school officials that all equipment and supplies purchased with federal funds are property of the district and will be removed when the program is no longer in place. Right, so let's take a look at CE 16.1. This item addresses capital expenditures, which are defined as any single equipment item for a purchase of $5,000 or more. The purchase must meet all of the requirements included on this slide. These components must be addressed in a written request to the CDE for approval prior to making the purchase. And the link to the pre-approval request form is included on the slide. The LEA request needs to ensure all required components apply to the purchase request. Specifically, the item must directly relate to a Title I Part A purpose and program, approved for assistance with specific Title I funds in the LEA's plan. LEAs or COEs need to provide a supporting quote or bid for each capital outlay request form submitted to the CDE for approval. Additionally, the purchase must be intended to improve, enhance, or expand the Title I eligible program to be funded. And the purchase must be necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient administration of the Title I eligible program. And it must be specific to the eligible Title I programs, as opposed to being a general expense required to carry out the agency's overall responsibilities. Next slide, please. We'll look now at two more items related to equipment purchased with Title I funds. In CE 16, the disposition of equipment on the LEA's inventory is addressed. For the disposition of equipment purchased with Title I Part A funds with a fair market value in excess of $5,000, the item may be retained by the LEA or sold at a percentage of the current market value, with the proceeds going to the CDE. For the disposition of equipment that is less than $5,000, it can be disposed without obligation to CDE. And the last component is CE 16.3, which states the LEA must conduct a physical inventory of the property, and the results must be reconciled with the property records at least every 2 years. So moving on to the next slide, we've provided some key points to address in your system for keeping track of your equipment inventory and control of your equipment that is allocable to the applicable federal programs. Maintain a historical inventory of all equipment with a unit price of over $500 and include private school equipment on the LEA inventory. Additionally, you must conduct a physical inventory of your equipment at least every 2 years and reconcile the results to your official LEA equipment inventory list and complete any necessary follow-up. If items are missing because they were stolen or lost, this must be recorded in a police report or in a letter to the police describing the items and giving their identification numbers. And lastly, historical inventory list of equipment purchased for $500 or more requires that copies are maintained at the district and in the school office. So moving on, we have a couple of quiz questions for you. Question number 1. If the LEA is considering a capital expenditure of $5,900, does the LEA need to request a pre-approval form from the CDE? Wow, lots of A+ students. Let's move on to show the answer. You got it, yes, because any expenditure of more than $5,000 needs pre-approval. All right, you're ready for the next question. Question number 2, read this carefully. To track control of equipment, an LEA must A, maintain a historical inventory of all equipment purchased for more than $500 per unit. B, maintain equipment inventory only at Title I schools. C, include 13 specific items for each inventoried item. And D, conduct a physical inventory of equipment at least every 2 years and reconcile the physical inventory to the LEA inventory list. I see the chat blowing up even before I'm done with reading the options. And E, A, C, and D. And I see, looking over at the chat, a lot of right answers. So let's click on to the next slide. And we can see the answer is A, C, and D. A, C, and D are all correct. And remember, equipment inventory applies to multiple federal programs, not just to Title I programs. So that's why B is not included as a correct response. Great job, everybody. All right, some additional equipment control considerations for you. As you're reflecting on your system for keeping track of your federally funded equipment, we ask that you please consider what is in place in your district's internal control system to prevent loss, damage, or theft. How does your LEA determine if equipment is needed for the implementation of your program? And how does the LEA determine if other unused equipment is available prior to using federal funds for additional equipment? And lastly, how does the LEA ensure that equipment purchased with federal funds is used only for authorized purposes? And remember, if equipment is lost, damaged, or stolen, you must investigate and document. And finally, we'd like to follow up with a quick look at contracts. And we're really circling back to what Debbie previously shared on day 1 about internal controls. It is important to determine the internal controls that you have in place for contracts. For example, who reconciles if the services have been rendered as stated in the contract? Who checks this? And when does this occur? Some key points to clearly delineate in your contracts are what services are to be performed and what goods are to be delivered. What are the dates when services will be or when the goods will be delivered? What are the locations where services will be performed or the goods delivered? As applicable, what are the number of students, teachers, etc., that are to be served by the program? Keep in mind, as you are clearly delineating each of these items in your contracts and your system for oversight, that the contract needs to also address what will occur should the contract need to be terminated. Should the group providing the information and services not follow through? And always, as you've heard over and over in our presentation, same thing applies to the contract. It must be aligned to federal statutes, and it must follow federal cost principles of being reasonable, necessary, and allocable to the federal grant. And next, Adrian will take a closer look at federal program monitoring.
Thank you, Jeannie. Wow, this has been an intense 2 days. So as we wrap up these 2 days, remember in day 1, I had said that there are many strings attached to the money. Well, over the past 2 workshop days, we have talked a lot about these strings. We have shared the rules and the requirements of the federal programs. And remember, all of these rules are in place to make sure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse. The monitoring process is the way that the state and federal government ensures that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse. In day one, we shared this slide. We explained that the monitoring of the state and federal programs are done through these processes. Federal program monitoring, otherwise known as FPM, annual state audits, federal audits, which are conducted in conjunction with the state audit process. And lastly, we talked about the Inspector General audits. But today we're going to close up with taking a closer look at the federal program monitoring process. In order to understand the FPM process, it is important to know the purpose of each of the funding. You can see the state and federal funding in this graphic that we shared in day one's workshop. But you might notice there is one additional funding that has been added, and we have included Ed Relief Funds. You can see we have placed these funds between state LCFF funds and the federal program funds. And this is because the use of Ed Relief Funds is broader than most federal categorical funds, but it requires adherence to federal requirements. So it's important to understand, how do these all work together? The FPM process makes sure that there is fiscal compliance. CDE indicated early on that the funding of Ed Relief Funds was going to take place during the FPM reviews. So for the past few years, CDE has been focusing on the review of the federal stimulus funds. But now they will be resuming the fiscal monitoring of all the title programs. These are the areas on this slide in which the fiscal monitoring and the Ed Relief Funds are reviewed. In the fiscal monitoring instrument, there are 6 specific areas. You can see that we have covered the areas in our 2-day presentation and workshop. We have covered time and effort. We've talked about allowable costs, supplement not supplant, cash management, funding, and reporting. In the federal stimulus monitoring instrument, you can also see many of the same areas as the fiscal monitoring instrument. But additionally, CDE reviews procedures and internal controls, procurement, equipment and inventory management, construction, and specific Ed Relief Funds of the coronavirus relief CR funds, the GEAR and ESSER funds. These are the items of the most frequently non-compliant items from last year's 22-23 FPM reviews of the federal stimulus monitoring instrument. There was an increase of LEAs having findings compared to last year's findings. Procurement consistently seems to have the highest frequency of LEAs having a finding in CA4. Now remember, the title of the instrument is Federal Stimulus Monitoring, but it all came from the CARES Act. So the CA is meaning CARES Act, and that kind of has stayed consistently throughout the years physically in the instrument. So sometimes it's confusing, but it is the CA04. You can find the FPM resources for the federal stimulus monitoring, as well as all the other programs that are monitored in the FPM review process, in CDE's box. And we've provided the link here on the slide so that you can click on it and you can take a look at all the FPM resources. And this particular slide is actually in there. So next slide, please. It's I guess often I wonder, like, why does the procurement keep coming up as the most findings of noncompliance? And so to take a quick look at the California or the CARES Act for procurement, remember, procurement is the process of acquisition. So of acquisition of goods, services. And so this particular item looks at looking at you're following the appropriate procurement processes for the contracts. And with contracts, the key points to remember is that there are both state and federal procurement requirements. The LEA must follow the most stringent requirement, and also state exemptions do not supersede federal requirements. So again, these are some components and key takeaways about your procurement process. In 4.1, the LEA must document all of the procurement. So LEAs must have and use documented procurement procedures for informal procurement methods in relation to the micro purchases and small purchases, and also formal procurement methods for competitive sealed bids, competitive proposals, and lastly, non-competitive proposals. And you might ask yourself, if you're not in the fiscal world, to me, it was very quite confusing. And so what CDE has done is they have provided a yearly state and federal procurement flow chart to help those fiscal folks as well as non-fiscal folks to understand this process. So we have provided the 2023 updated procurement flow chart for you today in the chat, and also we'll have it posted as our resources on our Canvas page. So you can see here that the updated California bid threshold for 2023 calendar year is 109,300. And so as 2004 calendar year, we move towards that, you'll see an updated flow chart as well. So again, all of these pieces is really, you can see how if you don't have both the fiscal side as well as the program side on the same page with understanding, at least for the program side, you know, conceptually, that there are these methods and they do need to be followed and they need to be documented. You don't want to have a finding during an FPM review for you know, some missing documentation. So again, it's important to understand that these are all part of the FPM review process. So as we conclude the 2-day fiscal workshop, we want to circle back to what we said at the beginning of day 1. Implementing your federal programs must be a team effort. Fiscal and program staff need to work together to make sure that your program expenditures are allowable and adequately documented, that the funds are spent within the grant timelines, and that the required procurement procedures are followed. Expenditures are charged to the correct accounts. And again, this is all to minimize any risks of the LEA not meeting their oversight responsibilities that were signed in the assurances in monitoring the public funds. And so that concludes our 2-day workshop. We want to thank you for joining us for these 2 days. We would ask that you take time to provide us with any feedback, either by using the link or the QR code. We do look at the feedback and we use it to guide our future planning. We will leave the chat open a few more minutes for anyone that wants to place any last-minute questions. And again, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we want to wish you a you know, happy holidays moving forward, and have a great afternoon. And there's our contact information if you would like to reach out to us. We definitely welcome that. So again, thank you and have a great afternoon.